There's a scandal happening in Canada, and we're not paying any attention to it. I'm going to talk to Ben Sharp, who was with the International Council on Clean Transportation. And a couple of months ago, they released a report called Impacts of Tampering on the Emissions Inventory for Heavy Duty Vehicles in Canada. Now, behind that title is a story that affects all of us, and that has to do with heavy duty trucks like semi tractors that are emitting. And they're not only are the owners and the drivers breaking the rules, but the technology to do it, the equipment to do it is sold openly. The provincial governments who are in charge of enforcing emissions regulations are simply turning a blind eye. And there are serious health implications, never mind climate change implications as well. So I'm going to welcome to the interview, Ben.
Thank you very much, Markham. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, Ben, I'm really glad that your organization did this report, because this seems like it's a long-standing issue. And by the way, I have asked every trucking association from Quebec to British Columbia for comment, including the National Trucking Association, and only one has got back to me so far, and they declined to be interviewed. So clearly the industry knows this is an issue and doesn't want to talk about it. So I'm glad I get to talk to you about it. So let's talk about tampering devices and services that are readily available.
Yeah, Markham. So this is a fairly unique challenge for us and for folks that are paying attention to this. And the reason is that it's very difficult or very expensive to figure out just the scope of the problem. So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency did a study looking at pickup trucks and vans and the extent to which this tampering issue was prevalent in the U.S. So we have some data to suggest that this is an issue. But from talking with fleets and fleet associations and some other experts, there is there's no consensus as to how pervasive this issue is. Is it 5% of fleet is doing this? Is it 2%? Is it 10%? So that was just one of the issues that we had doing this study, was just kind of trying to wrap our arms around how big of an issue this actually is. But in terms of what is tampering? So tampering is any time the owner or operator of a truck uses a hardware adjustment or plays around with the software in a way that affects the emissions output from the vehicle. So a lot of times you can make changes to the emission control equipment and you can get better fuel economy, for example, or you can make it such that maintenance, routine maintenance won't be as big of an issue. So there are some financial incentives for the trucking fleet to do this, which is why we see this happening. But it's very, very difficult to figure out the scope of the problem. But as you said, it's a very important one, and the XX emissions definitely have an impact in terms of public health. So which is why we're taking a look at this.
Right. Well, let's talk about how widespread it is. My impression from the little bit that is available, reporting that's been done, is that it's more than 2 or 5 or 10%. Now, I know you can't give us a specific percentage because the data isn't available, but if it's more than 10%, I mean, how widespread is this? Because if it's 2%, it doesn't sound like it's, that big a problem. But if it's 20 or 30%, 40%, then that would be a considerable problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that one of the things that's been very illustrative in doing this study is acknowledging that a very small percentage of vehicles is typically responsible for the overall, the bulk of your emissions inventory. So we tend to kind of use a rule of thumb that 20% of vehicles are responsible for 80% of emissions. So in a case where you have a large percentage of the fleet that's doing this tampering, that percentage is going to be even more skewed. So you're going to have even less percentage of the fleet making an even bigger percentage of the overall emissions inventory. So obviously, the more that this is happening, the bigger issue it is. And the reason why tampering is such a big deal is because when you disable or impede the performance of these emission control systems, emissions can go up by an order of magnitude or 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. So these are significant emissions increases on just one vehicle. So it's not the case that you're adding, 5 or 10 or 20% emissions. These are really substantial, like orders of magnitude increases in emissions from each vehicle. So that's why this becomes a really significant thing to pay attention to.
Well, let's talk about regulation. There are 4 provinces, including Alberta, that have no emissions regulations whatsoever, I understand. But in the other provinces where they do, basically there's no enforcement. It's kind of the Wild West out there. And so that provides all sorts of incentives, I would assume, for drivers or owners to make these modifications and get around the emission regulations.
Yeah, it's a significant challenge. And I think one of the reasons why, just big picture, why governments haven't been so keen to address this issue is because typically emission control legislation and regulation happens at the manufacturer level. So there's only a handful of manufacturers that are making heavy duty engines and vehicles. So from a regulatory burden perspective, it's fairly easy to keep up with all these companies and make sure that they're doing what they are supposed to be doing in terms of emission control systems. The challenge becomes exponentially more difficult when you think about regulating thousands and thousands of owner operators and fleets and all these individual companies that can be on the road at any given time. So the idea about or about regulating all of these thousands of companies and owner operators is just a really tall ask. And typically you're going to have the involvement of, the highway patrol or law enforcement. And those entities may not have the incentives to actually pull folks over and give them citations for these emission violations. So it's kind of a multifaceted, multi kind of government entity issue that we're dealing with here. But I think overall the challenge is that you have to keep an eye on thousands and thousands of companies rather than just a handful of manufacturers.
Okay, so let's set the scene here. The truck manufacturers have sophisticated emissions controls on their trucks. They come from the factory like that. But there are readily available. There are hardware changes and software changes. We in the performance community, they call them chipping it. So you re-chip or you modify, you either put in a new chip, computer chip, or you re-flash the existing computer chip to bypass the emissions controls. And all of that stuff is easily done. It's not expensive, which is why it's so widespread. And enforcing the regulations that prohibit that is very difficult. And it sounds like that's why the provincial governments, enforcement agencies just aren't putting a lot of effort into it.
That's right. Yeah, it's just a matter of government resources, which are always or tend to be lacking in a lot of cases, particularly for these in-use enforcement type of regulations. You mentioned that only a handful of provinces, I think it's Ontario, Quebec, and BC, actually have heavy duty inspection and maintenance programs. So this is by no means a very widespread policy instrument that's being used. And I think really it comes back to this issue of how many folks that you want to regulate and how difficult it is to regulate those thousands of companies on the road.
Well, let's talk about some of the recommendations that your report makes. The first one is that the federal government, the Canadian government, should explicitly prohibit tampering, and they should bring in legislation to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would go a very long way to solving kind of this patchwork of various provincial regulatory measures. Having a national program would provide clarity to both the fleets as well as the manufacturers, and just really kind of help to level set the playing field in terms of having an explicit understanding about what are the technologies that are required for both manufacturers to put on the vehicle, but also an expectation for the owners and the operators as to what they have to do and what they have to how they have to maintain that vehicle in good working order.
You also recommend that there should be steep penalties for not only those who do the tampering, but those who are providing the tampering devices and services.
Right. We think that this is a fairly low ask to make something that's illegal, to actually have some teeth in terms of making it putting some real disincentives to not want to do that cheating. Currently that there's just really nothing out there to prevent companies from providing these products and services to fleets. And we think that, the government should at least be saying, okay, this is illegal, and these are the penalties that go along with this illegal activity.
Another recommendation is remote sensing and roadside emission inspection. I mean, we know, I see, on the highway on a regular basis, I see the provincial agencies, stopping trucks to do inspections. So it's not like there isn't, a process already in place, but you're suggesting that emissions should be a part of that.
Yeah, we're really excited about remote sensing in particular as being a really cost-effective way to identify those trucks and those vehicles that are high emitters. It's a great screening tool, but I think you would have to layer on another piece on top of that, because the remote sensing can only tell you, okay, this is a vehicle that has really high emissions, but it doesn't tell you whether or not that's due to a legitimate reason or because there might be tampering. So remote sensing has to be tied to some type of other program where you would have an actual inspection and maintenance mechanism by which to actually probe those vehicles, which are the high emitters. But in terms of regulatory solutions, you can look at technology, and you can also look at those behavioral type practices, so the inspection and maintenance, to be able to have kind of a holistic approach for keeping emissions as what they should be.
Well, Ben, thank you very much for this. This is I think it's a serious problem, and hopefully the Canadian government and the provincial governments will somehow come up with a solution for it. Thank you very much for this.
No, thank you very much, Markham. It's great to be able to talk about the issue. Our group does a lot of focus rightly on electrification and zero emission vehicles. But we can't forget about all of the thousands and even millions of internal combustion vehicles that we have on the road. And we have to make those as clean as we can if we're going to be moving in the right direction in terms of climate and clean air. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.